In January 1933, Adolf Hitler's appointment as Chancellor marked a critical juncture for a Germany still shackled by Versailles Treaty restrictions. The treaty had gutted German military power, limiting the Reichswehr to 100,000 troops while banning tanks, military aircraft, submarines, and heavy weaponry. Yet this humiliation had merely driven militarism underground, rather than extinguishing it. The truth is that German rearmament predated Hitler. Throughout the 1920s, the Reichswehr had systematically evaded Versailles through creative subterfuge. Secret protocols with the Soviet Union, formalized in the 1922 Treaty of Rapallo, allowed German officers to test prohibited weapons on Soviet soil. At facilities like Lipetsk, Kazan, and Tomka, German pilots trained on combat aircraft, tankers practiced maneuvers, and chemists experimented with poison gas, all beyond the reach of Allied inspection commissions. This wasn't mere violation, it was institutional conspiracy involving the highest levels of military command. What Hitler brought wasn't the idea of rearmament, but rather the political will to transform covert preparations into explicit state policy, backed by totalitarian control that could mobilize Germany's entire economy for war. The pace accelerated dramatically. Where Weimar-era generals had proceeded cautiously to avoid international backlash, the Nazi regime operated with brazen disregard for consequences, gambling that Western powers lacked the stomach for confrontation. The regime's economic strategy rested on a fraudulent foundation. Hitler's finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht, engineered the Mefo Bills scheme, essentially a massive shell game where a fictitious company issued promissory notes to arms manufacturers, allowing weapons production to explode without appearing in government budgets. This created the illusion of fiscal responsibility while building a war machine. The contradiction was stark. Official statistics showed balanced budgets, while factories churned out tanks and aircraft at unprecedented rates. This pyramid scheme postponed but could not prevent eventual economic crisis. It could only function if Germany conquered resource-rich territories before the bills came due. The year 1935 marked Germany's public repudiation of Versailles. On March 16th, Hitler announced conscription and formally revealed the Luftwaffe's existence, daring the international community to respond. Britain and France protested but took no concrete action, a pattern that would repeat disastrously. The Anglo-German naval agreement, signed just months later, actually legitimized German naval expansion by permitting a fleet 35% the size of Britain's, a massive increase from Versailles limits. This diplomatic coup demonstrated that brazen treaty violation could be rewarded rather than punished. The Wehrmacht's expansion was quantitative and qualitative. The Heer grew from 7 divisions in 1933 to over 50 by 1939, but more significant was the doctrinal revolution. German theorists, studying their 1918 defeat, concluded that future wars must be decided rapidly through maneuver rather than grinding attrition. Officers like Heinz Guderian championed mechanized warfare, envisioning concentrated armored thrusts supported by tactical air power, what would later be mythologized as Blitzkrieg, though the Germans themselves never used this term officially. However, this doctrine had critical flaws that propaganda concealed. The Wehrmacht of 1939 remained heavily dependent on horse-drawn transport. Only a fraction of divisions were fully motorized. German tanks, while tactically innovative, were often mechanically unreliable and outgunned by Allied counterparts. The much-vaunted panzer divisions possessed more Panzer I and II light tanks, essentially machine gun carriers with thin armor, than the heavier Panzer III and IV models. What German forces possessed was superior tactical coordination and operational-level planning, not overwhelming technological superiority. The Luftwaffe's development followed similar patterns of appearance versus reality. While Goering boasted of invincible air fleets, the actual force structure revealed concerning weaknesses. German aircraft production emphasized quantity over strategic depth. The medium bombers like the Heinkel He-111 and Dornier Do-17 lacked the range, bomb load, and defensive armament for strategic bombing campaigns. The famed Stuka dive bomber, while psychologically terrifying and tactically effective against undefended targets, proved desperately vulnerable to modern fighters. a weakness that would become catastrophically apparent over Britain. The Kriegsmarine faced the starkest resource constraints. Plan Z, the ambitious naval expansion program approved in 1939, envisioned a balanced fleet including aircraft carriers and battleships to challenge British maritime supremacy by the mid-1940s. This timeline reveals Hitler's strategic miscalculation. He believed war with Britain could be delayed until Germany achieved naval parity. When war erupted in September 1939, the Kriegsmarine possessed a fraction of its planned strength, forcing reliance on submarine commerce raiding, a strategy that had ultimately failed in World War I. Germany's economic mobilization for war occurred within a fundamentally unsustainable framework. The four-year plan, launched in 1936 under Göring's direction, aimed for autarky, economic self-sufficiency that would enable Germany to wage war despite blockade. Massive investments went into synthetic fuel production, ersatz rubber, and industrial expansion. Yet Germany remained critically dependent on imports of Swedish iron ore, Romanian oil, and Soviet grain. The autarky project was more propaganda than reality. Germany's war economy required continuous conquest to access the resources it lacked domestically. Western responses to German rearmament were catastrophically inadequate, rooted in a combination of war wariness, economic depression, domestic political divisions, and fundamental misunderstanding of Nazi ideology. British and French leaders, scarred by World War I's carnage, desperately wanted to believe Hitler's claims of limited revisionist aims. The policy of appeasement rested on the assumption that satisfying Germany's legitimate grievances would satiate its ambitions and preserve peace. This was a profound miscalculation. Hitler's objectives weren't limited territorial adjustments, but rather racial empire building on a continental scale. His ideological vision, laid out explicitly in Mein Kampf, demanded Lebensraum, living space, to be seized in Eastern Europe through conquest and colonization. The Western democracies' failure to recognize this ideological dimension, treating Hitler as a conventional nationalist rather than a revolutionary racist ideologue, proved disastrous. By September 1939, Germany had constructed a formidable but flawed military instrument. The Wehrmacht possessed tactical excellence, innovative doctrine, and high morale, but rested on an unsustainable economic foundation that required continuous victory to avoid collapse. The regime had successfully created the appearance of overwhelming military superiority through propaganda, deception, and the West's willingness to be deceived. What followed would test whether operational brilliance could compensate for strategic overreach and economic fragility. The invasion of Poland represented Nazi Germany's first full-scale implementation of its military doctrine, but equally significant was the elaborate deception campaign constructed to justify naked aggression. The regime understood that both domestic morale and international perception required a veneer of legitimacy, however transparently false. Throughout the summer of 1939, German intelligence services orchestrated a series of provocations designed to create the pretext for war. The most infamous was Operation Himmler, executed on August 31st at the Gleiwitz radio station near the Polish border. SS operatives dressed in Polish uniforms staged a fake attack on the German facility, even leaving behind corpses. Concentration camp prisoners murdered specifically for this theatrical purpose, as supposed evidence of Polish aggression. This macabre performance was meticulously documented and immediately broadcast to justify the defensive invasion launched hours later. This was no isolated incident, but rather the culmination of systematic false flag operations. Similar staged attacks occurred at Hochlinden and other border locations. The propaganda apparatus, under Joseph Goebbels' direction, had spent weeks manufacturing a narrative of German victimhood, claiming widespread persecution of ethnic German minorities in Poland and portraying the Polish state as an aggressive threat to European peace. These fabrications were presented through newsreels, radio broadcasts, and press releases with such coordination and repetition that many ordinary Germans genuinely believed their nation was responding to Polish provocations rather than initiating unprovoked conquest. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, the Wehrmacht launched Fall Weiss, Case White, the invasion of Poland. The operation involved approximately 1.5 million German troops, organized into two army groups. Army Group North, under Fedor von Bock, would strike from Pomerania and East Prussia to isolate the Polish corridor and advance on Warsaw from the north. Army Group South, commanded by Gerd von Rundstedt, would attack from Silesia and Slovakia, driving northeast toward the capital and the Romanian bridgehead, where Poland intended to establish defensive lines. The Luftwaffe's role in the opening hours has been subject to considerable mythologization. While German aircraft did strike Polish airfields at dawn, claims that the Polish Air Force was destroyed on the ground are exaggerated. Most Polish aircraft had been dispersed to auxiliary fields before the attack and continued operating throughout the campaign, though overwhelmed by German numerical superiority. What the Luftwaffe did achieve was disruption of Polish communications and transportation networks, hindering coordinated defensive responses. The Polish military situation was dire from the outset, but not due to incompetence or backwardness as Nazi propaganda claimed. Poland faced impossible strategic circumstances. Polish planners understood they couldn't defend the entire 750-mile frontier against simultaneous German and potentially Soviet attack. Their strategy relied on conducting a fighting withdrawal to the Romanian bridgehead in southeast Poland while awaiting promised French and British offensive action in the west that never materialized. This plan, however rational given Poland's position, couldn't survive the reality of German mechanized penetration combined with Allied inaction. The Wehrmacht's operational execution during the Polish campaign revealed both the strengths and limitations of its emerging doctrine. Panzer divisions, concentrated at breakthrough points rather than dispersed along the front, achieved dramatic penetrations. The encirclement of Polish forces in the Bzura pocket west of Warsaw demonstrated the potential of rapid mechanized maneuver. However, German performance was far from the flawless exhibition portrayed in propaganda. Logistics proved problematic. Fuel and ammunition shortages slowed advances. Coordination between fast-moving armor and slower infantry divisions created dangerous gaps. Many panzer divisions suffered mechanical breakdown rates exceeding 30%. The human cost of the campaign is often overshadowed by its strategic significance. For Polish forces, the fighting was desperate and often heroic. Despite being outmaneuvered and outgunned, Polish units conducted determined defensive stands and even launched counterattacks, most notably the Bzura offensive, which temporarily threatened German forces west of Warsaw. The stereotype of Polish cavalry charging German tanks, a myth perpetuated by both German and later Soviet propaganda, obscures the reality of competent Polish military performance under impossible conditions. The civilian dimension of the invasion revealed the true nature of Nazi intentions in the East. This wasn't merely territorial conquest, but the beginning of racial reorganization. Einsatzgruppen, special SS units, followed combat troops, systematically murdering Polish intellectuals, clergy, and potential resistance leaders. Tens of thousands were executed in the campaign's opening weeks. Jewish communities faced immediate persecution, forced into ghettos, and subjected to systematic violence. These actions weren't incidental to military operations, but central to Nazi objectives. The invasion aimed not just to defeat Poland militarily, but to destroy it as a national entity. The Soviet invasion of eastern Poland on September 17th sealed the nation's fate, though this wasn't an unexpected development, but rather the fulfillment of the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed just 3 weeks before the German attack. This cynical agreement between totalitarian powers divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Stalin's motives were complex, partly opportunistic territorial expansion, partly deep distrust of Western intentions, partly a desperate attempt to buy time before the inevitable Nazi-Soviet confrontation. For Poland, caught between two predatory empires, the result was catastrophic partition. The Western response to the invasion exposed the bankruptcy of appeasement policy while simultaneously demonstrating continued unwillingness to accept its failure. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd, fulfilling treaty obligations to Poland, but this declaration remained almost entirely symbolic. The promised major offensive in the West never materialized. French forces made a tentative probe into the Saarland before withdrawing. The RAF was prohibited from bombing German military targets for fear of German retaliation. This phony war, or Blitzkrieg, demonstrated that declaring war and actually waging it were entirely different propositions. For the Nazi regime, Poland's rapid defeat seemed to validate its entire military and ideological program. The campaign had been completed in just over a month, with German casualties around 16,000 killed, significant but far less than the bloodbath of World War I. Hitler's gamble that France and Britain lacked the will to intervene effectively appeared confirmed. The Wehrmacht's performance, despite its imperfections, had successfully executed rapid mechanized warfare on a scale never before seen. German newsreels showed endless columns of Polish prisoners, destroyed enemy equipment, and jubilant soldiers, carefully edited to present an image of effortless superiority. This propaganda success had dangerous strategic consequences. It reinforced Hitler's conviction in his own military genius and his belief that Western democracies were decadent and weak. It convinced many in the German high command that the new methods of warfare could indeed achieve rapid, decisive victories without the grinding attrition of 1914-1918. Most crucially, it established a pattern of operational success, masking strategic incoherence. Germany had now provoked a general European war without any clear plan for how to conclude it favorably. The aftermath of Poland's defeat revealed the regime's true character. Western Poland was directly annexed to the Reich, with brutal Germanization programs implemented immediately. The remaining territory became the general government, essentially a colonial exploitation zone, where the Polish population was reduced to slave labor status. The Jewish population was concentrated in ghettos as a preliminary to genocide. Intellectuals, professionals, and political leaders were systematically murdered in operations like the AB Action. What had been presented to the German public as a limited border conflict to resolve grievances was revealed as a war of racial extermination and colonial conquest. For ordinary Germans, the campaign's rapid conclusion brought relief mixed with the first signs of doubt. The war had been portrayed as defensive and necessary, but the speed of victory and the absence of Western intervention raised questions about whether this defensive war might expand into something far more dangerous. Letters from soldiers began filtering back, describing not just military operations, but disturbing violence against civilians. Casualty notifications arrived in communities across Germany. The state's censorship apparatus worked to suppress dissent, but the foundations of the people's community mythology began showing their first cracks. September 1939 established patterns that would define Germany's war. Brilliant operational-level military performance would repeatedly overcome tactical challenges, while strategic incoherence and ideological criminality guaranteed ultimate failure. Propaganda would construct narratives of invincibility, even as structural weaknesses accumulated. Initial victories would breed dangerous overconfidence, leading to ever more reckless escalation. And behind the facade of military conquest, a program of genocidal racial reorganization would proceed with bureaucratic efficiency, revealing the true nature of the regime's ambitions in the East. The German offensive in the West during May and June 1940 has been mythologized as the perfect execution of Blitzkrieg doctrine, a virtuoso military performance that shattered Allied armies in 6 weeks. The reality was considerably more complex, involving significant German failures, Allied blunders, and outcomes shaped as much by chance and miscalculation as by tactical brilliance. The operational plan that delivered victory was itself the product of accident and improvisation rather than systematic planning. The original German strategy, Fallgelb in its initial form, envisioned a modified version of the 1914 Schlieffen Plan, a massive right hook through Belgium and Holland. This approach was entirely predictable, and Allied planning correctly anticipated it. The plan's inadequacy became apparent when a German liaison aircraft carrying operational documents crash-landed in Belgium in January 1940, compromising the entire scheme. What emerged instead was largely the work of Erich von Manstein, a corps commander whose alternative proposal had been repeatedly dismissed by the high command. Manstein's concept involved concentrating armored forces for a thrust through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, cutting Allied communications and encircling forces that had advanced into Belgium. This plan was risky to the point of recklessness. funneling Germany's entire armored reserve through narrow forest roads where a single demolished bridge could paralyze the advance. Hitler embraced it not because of its tactical sophistication, but because it appealed to his gambler's instinct for the dramatic and unexpected. The attack began on May 10th with German forces invading the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. This northern assault was a feint, deliberately designed to draw Allied forces forward into Belgium, where they could be cut off from behind. The deception succeeded beyond German expectations. French and British units, implementing their prearranged Plan D, rushed into Belgium to establish defensive lines, playing precisely into German hands. The Netherlands' conquest involved both military operations and war crimes. Rotterdam's center was devastated by Luftwaffe bombing on May 14th, killing approximately 900 civilians and destroying much of the historic city. This attack occurred even as surrender negotiations were underway and represented a deliberate act of terror bombing intended to shock the Dutch government into capitulation. It succeeded. The Netherlands surrendered that evening. German propaganda later justified this as military necessity, but operational records reveal it was fundamentally punitive, designed to demonstrate the costs of resistance. The decisive action occurred at Sedan, where German forces crossed the Meuse River on May 13th-14th. This operation has been portrayed as a testament to German tactical superiority, but it succeeded largely due to catastrophic French failures in command, communication, and reserve deployment. The French had adequate forces to contain the bridgehead if properly coordinated, but command paralysis at critical moments allowed German armor to break through. Guderian's Die-19 Panzer Corps, once across the Meuse, drove westward with stunning speed, covering 50 miles in 2 days, toward the English Channel. This dash to the coast created an enormous pocket containing the best British and French units, now trapped in Belgium with their supply lines severed. Yet the German success contained the seeds of future problems. The armored spearheads had outrun their infantry support, creating dangerously exposed flanks. Fuel and ammunition supplies struggled to keep pace with the advance. Tank mechanical breakdown rates climbed alarmingly. The German high command grew increasingly nervous about the vulnerabilities this rapid advance created, leading to hesitations that would prove significant. The most controversial decision of the campaign came on May 24th when Hitler personally ordered the panzer divisions to halt their advance on Dunkirk, where Allied forces were concentrating for evacuation. Historians continued debating this halt order. Goering convinced Hitler that the Luftwaffe could destroy the trapped forces without risking valuable armor. Some generals argued the tanks needed maintenance before the coming campaign against the French heartland. The marshy terrain around Dunkirk appeared unsuitable for armor operations. Hitler may have harbored illusions about negotiating peace with Britain and wanted to avoid humiliating the British army completely. Whatever the reasoning, the halt order allowed the Dunkirk evacuation to proceed. Between May 26th and June 4th, Operation Dynamo rescued approximately 338,000 Allied troops, including about 123,000 French soldiers. This has been portrayed in British national mythology as a miraculous deliverance, and indeed the evacuation's success exceeded all expectations. However, the rescued forces abandoned virtually all heavy equipment, tanks, artillery vehicles, representing a massive material defeat even as the personnel escaped. The evacuation's success owed much to the heroic efforts of the RAF, which prevented Luftwaffe domination of the beaches despite heavy losses. German aircraft did inflict significant casualties on ships and troops, but failed to prevent the evacuation. This failure foreshadowed the Luftwaffe's limitations in the coming Battle of Britain. The force was optimized for tactical ground support, not strategic interdiction or operations over water against naval targets. With the northern pocket eliminated, German forces turned south against the remaining French armies. The second phase of the campaign, beginning June 5th, encountered stiffer resistance than the initial breakthrough. French forces, fighting more coherently with shortened supply lines, inflicted significant casualties on attacking German units. However, numerical and material superiority, combined with superior German operational-level command, ultimately proved decisive. Paris was declared an open city and occupied on June 14th. The French government requested armistice terms on June 17th. The armistice ceremony, staged in the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918, was choreographed for maximum propaganda impact. Hitler's brief victory dance, captured on film, symbolized the regime's triumphalism. Yet the armistice terms themselves revealed strategic confusion. Rather than completely occupying France, Germany established a collaborationist regime in Vichy controlling roughly 40% of French territory. This decision, driven partly by insufficient occupation forces and partly by hopes of securing French acquiescence, created a quasi-independent French state that would complicate German policy throughout the war. The military statistics appeared overwhelming. Germany had defeated France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and expelled British forces from the continent in just 6 weeks, at a cost of approximately 45,000 German dead, significant casualties but incomparable to the millions lost in 1914-1918's trench warfare. Over 2 million Allied soldiers were captured. The psychological impact was shattering. France, considered a great military power with the world's largest army, had collapsed in a time frame that shocked even the Germans themselves. This rapid victory had profoundly dangerous consequences for German strategic thinking. It appeared to validate every assumption underlying the Wehrmacht's doctrine and the regime's ideology. The myth of German military invincibility was now seemingly proven by concrete results. Hitler's reputation as a military genius was established, not just in propaganda, but in the minds of his generals who had doubted him. The success convinced many in the German leadership that speed and willpower could overcome any obstacle, that superior élan could defeat material disadvantages, and that future campaigns would follow the same pattern of rapid, decisive victory. What this triumphalism obscured was how contingent the victory had been. The Ardennes thrust succeeded partly through daring, but equally through French command failures that weren't guaranteed to repeat against different opponents. The halt order at Dunkirk had allowed a significant British force to escape. Germany now occupied vast territories requiring substantial garrison forces, draining strength from the field army. Most critically, Britain remained undefeated and increasingly determined to continue the war, while the Soviet Union watched warily from the east. For the German population, the victory brought euphoria mixed with relief. The nightmare scenario of another prolonged war of attrition seemed averted. Casualty lists, while significant, were nothing like the carnage of the previous war. The regime's promises appeared vindicated. Street celebrations erupted across German cities. Hitler's popularity reached its zenith. Yet underneath this celebration, perceptive observers might have noted troubling signs. The war was expanding rather than concluding. Britain showed no signs of seeking peace, and the economic strains of mobilization were intensifying rather than easing. The Western campaign established a template of operational excellence, masking strategic incoherence that would characterize Germany's entire war effort. Tactically and operationally, the Wehrmacht had demonstrated remarkable capability. But strategy requires connecting military means to political ends, and here the picture was far murkier. What was Germany's war aim? What political settlement would conclude the conflict? How would Britain be forced to terms? These questions remained unanswered as the regime, intoxicated by success, began planning its most catastrophic gamble, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The defeat of France represented the high watermark of German military fortunes, the moment when tactical brilliance and operational innovation achieved their most spectacular results. It was also the moment when the regime's fundamental strategic bankruptcy became irreversible. Having defeated France, Germany had no clear path to concluding the war favorably. The victory had been too rapid to establish stable occupation, too incomplete to force Britain from the war, and too costly in material terms to be frequently repeated. The Wehrmacht had won a brilliant campaign, but trapped Germany in an unwinnable war. The Battle of Britain, waged in the skies over southern England from July through October 1940, represented the first significant check to German military expansion and exposed critical weaknesses in both Luftwaffe capabilities and Nazi strategic thinking. What began as a necessary preliminary to invasion evolved into an attritional struggle that Germany could not afford and ultimately could not win. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, existed more as aspiration than coherent strategy. The Wehrmacht had no experience with amphibious operations on the required scale, possessed inadequate landing craft, and faced a Royal Navy that outmatched the Kriegsmarine by an overwhelming margin. German naval commanders privately acknowledged that any invasion attempt without air superiority would be suicidal. This placed an impossible burden on the Luftwaffe. It had to not merely achieve temporary air superiority, but maintain it long enough to enable a cross-channel assault while simultaneously preventing the Royal Navy from annihilating the invasion fleet. Goering, characteristically, promised what he could not deliver. His assurances that the Luftwaffe could destroy the RAF and British war industry within weeks reflected both personal vanity and fundamental misunderstanding of the operational challenges involved. The Luftwaffe was a tactical air force optimized for supporting ground operations, not a strategic bombing force designed for independent air campaigns. Its medium bombers lacked the range, payload, and defensive armament for sustained operations over hostile territory. Its fighters, while excellent in performance, operated at extreme range when covering targets in southern England, leaving minimal loiter time over combat zones. The British possessed several crucial advantages that German intelligence consistently underestimated. The chain-home radar network provided early warning of incoming raids, allowing fighters to be vectored efficiently rather than flying standing patrols. Ground controllers coordinated interceptions through an integrated command system that maximized the effectiveness of limited fighter resources. British pilots fought over home territory, meaning those shot down but surviving could return to combat, while German aircrew became prisoners. And Britain's aircraft production, reorganized under Lord Beaverbrook's energetic direction, was actually outproducing Germany by summer 1940, a fact that astonished German planners who had assumed their industrial superiority. The Luftwaffe's campaign proceeded through several phases, each reflecting shifting German objectives as previous approaches failed. Initial attacks in July targeted channel convoys and coastal installations, testing British defenses while attempting to draw RAF fighters into attrition battles. These operations achieved limited success, but failed to degrade British fighter strength significantly. German losses actually exceeded British during this preliminary phase, an ominous indicator that Luftwaffe commanders chose to ignore. August brought intensified attacks on RAF airfields and radar stations in southern England, the campaign that came closest to achieving German objectives. Sustained attacks on sector stations threatened to degrade the RAF's command and control infrastructure. Fighter command was losing aircraft faster than replacements arrived, and, more critically, experienced pilot losses began exceeding training output. Several airfields were temporarily rendered non-operational. Had Germany maintained this pressure for several more weeks, the RAF's position might have become critical. Instead, the Luftwaffe shifted targets in early September, redirecting the offensive toward London and other industrial cities. This decision has been attributed to various factors: retaliation for RAF raids on Berlin, Hitler's impatience with slow progress, Goering's belief that attacking London would force the RAF to commit its last reserves to decisive battle. Whatever the reasoning, it represented a strategic blunder of the first order. The shift relieved pressure on RAF infrastructure at precisely the moment when continued attacks might have succeeded. Fighter command's battered sector stations received desperately needed respite to repair facilities and reorganize squadrons. The London Blitz, beginning on September 7th, demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of strategic bombing with 1940 technology. German bombers could reach London and inflict substantial destruction. The initial raid killed over 400 civilians and left thousands homeless. Sustained night bombing created horrific conditions for London's population, with tens of thousands sheltering in underground stations during raids. Yet the attacks failed completely to achieve their purported strategic objectives. War production continued, civilian morale proved resilient rather than collapsing, and the British government showed no inclination toward negotiation. The Blitz's failure revealed fundamental problems with the entire concept of strategic bombing as then practiced. Bombing accuracy with available technology was abysmal. Even in daylight, hitting specific industrial targets proved extremely difficult. Night bombing was largely indiscriminate area bombardment regardless of stated intentions. Bomb loads were insufficient to inflict decisive damage on dispersed industrial infrastructure. Fire suppression and civil defense measures proved more effective than anticipated. Most critically, there existed no mechanism to translate urban destruction into political capitulation by a determined opponent. German losses mounted unsustainably. During the critical period from July through October, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,887 aircraft destroyed, with hundreds more damaged. More significantly, experienced aircrew casualties could not be replaced at equivalent rates. Training pipelines that had been adequate for brief campaigns proved desperately insufficient for sustained operations. Quality of replacement crews declined noticeably as training was compressed to fill gaps in operational units. British losses during the same period, approximately 1,547 aircraft destroyed, were proportionally more sustainable due to several factors German planners had not anticipated. British aircraft production exceeded German output in fighters specifically, the critical category for defensive operations. Pilot training, while also strained, proved more robust than German equivalents. The integrated air defense system meant British fighters achieved higher sortie rates with better tactical intelligence than their German counterparts. Most decisively, the strategic situation fundamentally favored defenders fighting over their own territory with short supply lines against attackers operating at extreme range. By late October, the Luftwaffe's daylight offensive had clearly failed. Unsustainable loss rates forced a shift to night bombing where German navigational limitations and British defensive adaptations reduced effectiveness further. Operation Sea Lion, already postponed from September, was indefinitely shelved and units earmarked for invasion were redeployed. The immediate threat to Britain had passed, though the night blitz would continue into 1941, inflicting misery without strategic effect. The battle's consequences extended far beyond the immediate tactical outcome. For the first time, German forces had engaged in sustained combat against a prepared, technologically comparable opponent, and failed to achieve their objectives. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility, carefully cultivated through propaganda about Poland and France, was shattered among those privy to actual loss statistics. Hitler's personal involvement in operational decisions, including the disastrous shift to city bombing, demonstrated the dangers of his interference in military planning. The failure fundamentally altered German strategic calculations. With Britain undefeated and increasingly supported by American material aid, Germany faced a protracted two-front war should it move against the Soviet Union. Rational strategic analysis suggested either concentrating forces to defeat Britain decisively or reaching accommodation before opening another front. Instead, the regime doubled down on expansion, interpreting the Battle of Britain not as a warning about overreach, but merely as a tactical setback in a broader campaign of conquest. For Britain, survival through the summer and autumn of 1940 provided psychological vindication of the decision to fight on after France's collapse. Churchill's defiant rhetoric found validation in concrete military performance. The few Fighter Command's pilots achieved iconic status that, while perhaps overstated in immediate military terms, represented genuine strategic significance. Britain had demonstrated that German military power was not irresistible, that modern technology and sound defensive strategy could thwart offensive operations, and that totalitarian regimes could be defied successfully. The battle also revealed emerging patterns of modern aerial warfare that would shape the remainder of the conflict. Air superiority required not just capable aircraft, but integrated systems: radar, communications, command and control, logistics, training, and production. Technological innovation occurred at accelerating rates, with improvements in aircraft performance, tactics, and electronic warfare appearing constantly. Strategic bombing's limitations were becoming apparent, though this lesson would be largely ignored as both sides invested massively in bomber fleets throughout the war. Most ominously for Germany, The Battle of Britain consumed irreplaceable resources, experienced aircrew, modern aircraft, fuel stocks, that would be desperately needed for operations against the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe that invaded Russia in June 1941 was quantitatively larger but qualitatively weaker than the force that had attacked France, with training standards declining and maintenance issues proliferating. The strategic costs of the British campaign extended far beyond the immediate defeat. By winter 1940, Germany found itself in a paradoxical position. It had conquered most of Western Europe, yet remained unable to conclude the war on favorable terms. Britain was undefeated and growing stronger with American support. The Soviet Union remained a looming threat in the East, its intentions uncertain, but certainly not benign. Germany's economy strained under mobilization demands, while occupied territories drained military resources for garrison duties. Victory in the West had proven hollow, creating obligations without resolving the fundamental strategic dilemma of how to actually win the war. The regime's response to this impasse would be characteristically reckless. Rather than consolidating gains or seeking diplomatic solutions, Hitler would launch the most catastrophic military gamble in modern history, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, represented the culmination of Nazi ideology translated into military strategy, a war of racial annihilation disguised as preventive conflict, unprecedented in scale and ultimately catastrophic in outcome. Understanding this campaign requires recognizing that it was never purely a military operation, but rather an ideological crusade intended to destroy the Soviet state, enslave the Slavic population, and seize Lebensraum for German colonization. The operation's planning revealed fundamental tensions between military logic and ideological imperatives. Professional military staff advocated concentrated drives toward specific objectives: Moscow as the political and transportation hub, or Ukraine's industrial and agricultural resources. Hitler's Directive 21 instead mandated simultaneous offensives across a 1,800-mile front by 3 army groups targeting Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine respectively. This dispersion of effort reflected ideological rather than operational priorities. Leningrad as the cradle of Bolshevism to be erased, Ukraine as living space to be colonized, Moscow as a secondary concern despite its strategic centrality. German intelligence catastrophically underestimated Soviet military capacity. Estimates suggested the Red Army possessed perhaps 200 divisions. The actual figure exceeded 400. German planners assumed Soviet forces would collapse rapidly once their forward positions were overrun, failing to account for the depth of Soviet territory, the capacity to raise new formations, or the willingness to accept casualties that would have shattered any Western army. This fundamental intelligence failure stemmed partly from racism, the assumption that Slavic subhumans under communist misrule could not mount effective resistance, and partly from mirror imaging, projecting German organizational limitations onto a fundamentally different military system. The invasion force assembled for Barbarossa was indeed the largest military operation in history to that point. Over 3 million German and Axis troops, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. Yet even these staggering numbers proved inadequate for the assigned tasks. The force-to-space ratio meant German units were spread far thinner than in previous campaigns. Logistics were nightmarish. Soviet rail gauges differed from European standard, requiring either track conversion or transshipment. The road network was primitive, turning to impassable mud during seasonal rains. Most critically, the Wehrmacht remained largely horse-drawn despite its mechanized spearheads. Over 600,000 horses accompanied the invasion, themselves requiring fodder that strained logistics further. The initial assault achieved stunning tactical success through complete strategic surprise. Despite numerous warnings from intelligence sources including British decrypts, Soviet reconnaissance, and even German deserters, Stalin refused to believe Hitler would violate their non-aggression pact so soon. Soviet forces were caught mid-reorganization, poorly deployed, and under orders not to respond to provocations. The Luftwaffe destroyed approximately 2,000 Soviet aircraft in the first 2 days, many caught on the ground. German armor penetrated deep into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies in vast pockets around Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. These tactical victories created dangerous illusions of imminent overall victory. Hitler's July 4th directive claimed the campaign was essentially won, requiring only mopping up remaining Soviet forces. German soldiers wrote home expecting to be in Moscow within weeks. Newsreels showed endless columns of Soviet prisoners and captured equipment, reinforcing the narrative of Slavic inferiority and Germanic superiority. Yet this triumphalism masked accumulating problems that would prove insurmountable. The encircled Soviet formations, while cut off and eventually forced to surrender, absorbed time and combat power. German infantry divisions had to besiege these pockets while armor raced ahead, creating dangerous gaps. Soviet units fought with unexpected ferocity, often to the last man rather than surrendering when hopeless. Each pocket eliminated meant tens of thousands of prisoners requiring guarding, feeding, and transport, draining resources from forward operations. And behind German lines, bypassed Soviet units formed the nucleus of partisan movements that would plague occupation forces throughout the war. Supply problems emerged almost immediately and worsened progressively. Advancing units outran their logistics, with fuel and ammunition shortages halting operations. The primitive Soviet road network deteriorated rapidly under military traffic. Dust in summer and mud in autumn clogged engines and immobilized vehicles. Tank mechanical reliability, marginal even in ideal conditions, collapsed under sustained operations in harsh terrain. By August, many panzer divisions were operating at 50% or less of authorized strength due to mechanical breakdowns, with repair parts unavailable and recovery systems overwhelmed. The Wehrmacht's logistical system had been designed for short campaigns in Western Europe with excellent infrastructure. It proved catastrophically inadequate for the vast distances and primitive conditions of the Soviet Union. Supply dumps were hundreds of miles behind advancing spearheads. Trains couldn't keep pace with the advance. Truck transport was insufficient and unreliable. The gap between operational level success and logistical sustainability grew exponentially as forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory. Soviet resistance, while initially chaotic, demonstrated resilience that shattered German assumptions. New armies appeared seemingly from nowhere as the Soviet system mobilized reserves from across its vast territory. Quality of Soviet troops and equipment improved as pre-war incompetents were removed and veteran units learned from early disasters. Counterattacks, while often unsuccessful operationally, imposed delays and casualties that accumulated to strategic significance. Most importantly, the Soviet state did not collapse despite catastrophic military defeats. Stalin's regime proved far more durable than Hitler's ideology allowed him to comprehend. By late summer, strategic tensions between Hitler and his generals reached crisis point. Military professionals advocated concentrating forces for a drive on Moscow before winter. Hitler instead diverted forces southward to encircle Kiev and secure Ukraine's resources, then northward toward Leningrad. The massive Kiev pocket yielded over 600,000 prisoners and appeared to vindicate Hitler's judgment, but consumed precious weeks of good weather. When forces finally concentrated for the Moscow offensive in October, the seasonal rains had already begun. Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, represented Germany's last chance to achieve decisive victory in 1941. Initial operations achieved significant success, with vast encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk. German spearheads reached Moscow's suburbs, close enough to see the Kremlin through binoculars. Soviet government departments evacuated eastward. Panic briefly gripped Moscow as German breakthrough seemed imminent. Yet the offensive culminated just short of decisive success, exhausted by months of combat, ravaged by weather, and finally stopped by Soviet counterattacks employing fresh reserves from Siberia. The onset of winter exposed the Wehrmacht's complete unpreparedness for extended operations in Russian conditions. Soldiers wore summer uniforms as temperatures plummeted to -40°C. Weapons froze and malfunctioned. Vehicle engines seized without specialized lubricants. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat losses in many units. Supply of winter clothing and equipment had been deprioritized based on assumptions the campaign would conclude before winter. A catastrophic miscalculation that cost tens of thousands of preventable casualties. Soviet counteroffensives in December drove German forces back from Moscow's outskirts, the first major German retreat of the war. While the Red Army lacked strength for strategic breakthrough, the psychological impact was devastating. German invincibility was shattered not just in enemy perception, but in German consciousness. Soldiers who had expected victory parades instead faced frozen hell and desperate defensive battles. Officers who had scorned Soviet military capability now confronted an enemy who absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any Western army and continued fighting. The ideological dimension of Barbarossa distinguished it fundamentally from previous campaigns. This wasn't conquest for limited territorial or political objectives, but rather a war of racial extermination. Einsatzgruppen followed combat units, systematically murdering Jews, communists, and educated Slavs. The hunger plan deliberately aimed to starve tens of millions of Soviet civilians to free agricultural resources for Germany. Commissar Order directed execution of Soviet political officers without trial. Treatment of Soviet prisoners of war was genocidal. Millions died from starvation, exposure, and murder in improvised camps. These weren't unfortunate excesses, but central to the campaign's ideological purpose. This criminal brutality had direct military consequences. It ensured Soviet resistance would be fanatical, understanding that surrender meant not prisoner status, but extermination. It created partisan movements behind German lines that tied down entire divisions in anti-guerrilla operations. It prevented the Wehrmacht from exploiting genuine anti-Stalin sentiment in occupied territories, particularly Ukraine, where German forces were initially greeted as liberators before Nazi racial policy revealed its true nature. Militarily counterproductive brutality proceeded systematically because ideology trumped strategic rationality. By year's end, Barbarossa had clearly failed in its strategic objectives. Moscow remained unconquered, Leningrad under siege but unoccupied, and Soviet resistance intensifying rather than collapsing. German casualties exceeded 750,000, including irreplaceable veteran personnel and much of the pre-war officer corps. Equipment losses were staggering, over 2,000 tanks and 6,000 aircraft destroyed. The logistical system was broken beyond repair for sustained offensive operations. Winter had barely begun, and the Wehrmacht faced months of defensive combat under conditions for which it was neither equipped nor prepared. The campaign's failure fundamentally transformed the war's character. Germany was now committed to indefinite struggle on the Eastern Front, consuming the vast majority of its military resources. The quick victory paradigm that had worked in Poland and France was definitively broken. The Red Army, while bloodied, remained a functional force with vast reserves. Soviet industry, relocated eastward beyond German reach, was beginning massive production increases. Most ominously, Germany had provoked exactly the prolonged attritional war its entire strategic concept sought to avoid. For ordinary German soldiers, the Eastern Front became synonymous with suffering on a scale unimaginable in previous campaigns. Letters home spoke not of heroic victories but of cold, hunger, and endless combat against an apparently inexhaustible enemy. The contrast between propaganda narratives of triumph and the reality of desperate defensive battles eroded morale and trust in leadership. Soldiers who had marched east expecting to be home by Christmas instead faced the prospect of indefinite combat in a hostile land against an enemy who refused to accept defeat. The economic implications were equally catastrophic. The resources Germany had invaded to seize remained largely inaccessible, with Soviet scorched earth tactics destroying infrastructure and production facilities. The campaign consumed vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, and equipment, while adding conquered territories that required extensive garrison forces but provided minimal economic return. Rather than resolving Germany's resource constraints, Barbarossa intensified them while simultaneously ensuring those constraints would persist indefinitely. Barbarossa represented the intersection of ideological fanaticism and strategic bankruptcy. It was launched without adequate resources, based on racist assumptions about enemy inferiority, and pursued objectives that were simultaneously essential to Nazi ideology and militarily unattainable. Its failure guaranteed Germany would lose the war, though the actual defeat would require 3 more years of increasingly desperate combat. The campaign demonstrated conclusively that tactical and operational excellence cannot compensate for strategic incoherence, and that ideological conviction, however fervently held, cannot overcome material reality. The Wehrmacht had marched east as conquerors. Those who survived would retreat as defeated men, their illusions of invincibility shattered in the frozen wastes of Russia.